All right. Hello and welcome back. I'm Eric Sunset, your host of the Doc Buddy Journal. Here at Doc Buddy, we deliver healthcare solutions that take the pain and cost out of broken workflows. From the ASC to the clinic to on call at the hospital, Doc Buddy helps providers access, create, and move data seamlessly, all from the point of care. You can learn more about us and our solutions at docbuddy.com. And today we're joined by Anish Patankar, who serves as SVP and GM of Oncology Informatics Software with Elekta. Elekta is a global Swedish company that develops and produces radiation therapy and radiosurgery related equipment and clinical management for the treatment of cancer and brain disorders. Anish, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Eric, for having me. Happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
So are we, and thanks so much for making a little room in your schedule to cover some hot topics in healthcare today, centering around AI in oncology. But before we sort of dive in, what else should listeners know about you?
I think one thing I have a long background in healthcare, of course, and I'm very passionate about delivering innovation in healthcare technologies, of course, benefiting patients. And I think one thing I would like to maybe state out loud is that you do see a growing disparity in sort of how healthcare innovation is now reaching different parts of the globe. And being part of a global organization, one thing I really strive to do is to make sure that we can deliver this innovation to all of our clinical customers globally, not only where it's easy to deliver. And that means customers who adopt these technologies on the cloud, customers that deploy these technologies on the premises, and so on. So having that consistency in sort of benefiting patients across the globe is very important to me personally, and that is what I really aim to do.
Well, I know with your background, that's no small task, but it seems like you're the right man for the job, and that flexibility of either on cloud in the cloud or on premises for the solutions that you deploy, that sort of gives you a leg up here because healthcare is rushing to adopt artificial intelligence and the related solutions faster than it has ever sought to adopt a new technology. Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
I think couple factors, right? If you look at the specific impact on imaging technologies in healthcare, right? The impact of AI, the pace of innovation and the way you can deploy that innovation in the cloud or on the premises has been greatly accelerated by the advancement of the GPU tech, right? And I guess we all see that a lot. So you started to see that explosion starting from radiology, where you could sort of contour organs in imaging, CT images, MRI, PET scans, different kinds of images, and more now that expanding from radiology into oncology, neurology, cardiology, into different sort of disease areas. And I think that the enablement of deploying GPUs in the cloud and the readiness of the models to be deployed anywhere where the physicians are to get access to those results in almost near instantaneous speed, that is causing one aspect of explosion of AI adoption in our space, right? The other aspect I would say is sort of the power to harness data. And then you see this in sort of, you have so much data in healthcare, which is so much siloed. And I think so much has been spoken about this topic. There's just having sort of the conversation between the doctor and the patient, the amount of literature that's out there, the amount of innovation that's happening in different areas that impact healthcare, and then the taking all of these parameters as input into a large language model and then giving the right context to a physician who's at the bedside with the patient in the hospital room or in their clinic, giving something more actionable to the physician rather than them relying only on their experience or expertise. I think that's the other source of explosion of AI in healthcare, right? So making sense of all this data previously, which was so siloed, putting it together, getting sort of results out of it, we are seeing the adoption just really picking up.
When you hit the nail on the head, we kind of laughed before we started to record that prior guests of the Doc Buddy Journal, highly accomplished individuals, great surgeons, leaders in U.S. healthcare, they end up with sort of a best guess around what AI will really mean for a provider and to an extent the patient as well. And you see some of the wilder takes out there that AI will never work, we'll never want it. I don't think that's true. But then the other end of that spectrum is we're not going to need a provider anymore. We're not going to need a doctor anymore. And I don't think that's true either. So somewhere landing in the middle where AI or predictive analytics or machine learning or by whatever name that you want to call it is really being built meaningfully to augment that provider's workflow. And one of the things that you just mentioned I want to key in on is sort of around that operational efficiency that an LLM, and that's a large language model, something like a chat GPT, for our audience who may not be familiar, uh, the efficiency that something like that can provide. So, can we go a little bit deeper there on what that may end up meaning in the future, or maybe even what it means right now?
No, absolutely, right. I think the reality is always in the middle. The providers are not going away, and AI will definitely be adopted in the workflow, operationally, clinically, and every which way, right? If you look at the impact that LLMs have brought us here, Eric, right? I mean, one thing is there's so much data to make sense out of in healthcare, and trying to sort of do that in a manual way, or sort of relying on the physicians to be up to date with every new regulation on the compliance side, for example, every new clinical innovation that's happened in terms of outcomes. It's almost impossible for everybody to keep up with all of that. And on top of that, there are guidelines to be followed. These guidelines can come from the institution where a physician is working. They can come because of the payers that may be associated with that particular hospital or clinic, or could be any other regional or governmental factors, because sometimes in socialized medicine in the NHS in the UK, certain provinces in Canada, or in the US also, in depending on what sort of format you're practicing medicine in, there are all these things that come into play. And when you talk about operational efficiencies, the ability of one person to rely only on their experience and expertise to translate and digitize all of that, it's just not humanly possible. And that's where the power of a large language model to take all of these parameters into consideration and then say, how does all of this apply to the patient who's sitting in front of you? So the biggest impact I see in terms of operationalization is helping the physician determine a treatment pathway in terms of operational workflow to say what's going to be the most relevant for the patient case that you are looking at right now. And I think that's where we see the biggest impact going forward in terms of efficiencies for the clinical team.
I couldn't agree with you more there. And I want to look backwards, if we can, for just a second. That in the early days of EHR, going back to the early, or I guess rather the late 2000s, early 2010s, this was when Fitbits were starting to be popular and things like the Apple Watch were on the horizon and things like the Whoop tracking band that created a tremendous amount of data. Going back 15 or so years, you'd ask a cardiologist, doc, I wear a Fitbit. Can I give you my data? And they would say, absolutely not. That's too much liability exposure. I can't
Yep,
handle that much information. I can't do anything with it. And if I
yep,
miss
yep,
something critical to you, then it's my fault.
yep,
So keep it to
right.
yourself, not interested in it. But with remote patient monitoring, with all of the patient care coordinators at work to be sure that sort of these patients in a value based care model are doing everything that they need to, I would imagine that an LLM or something like it will be able to ingest all of this information and then turn it into data, I guess, to be very specific about the terminology. Are you seeing anything along those lines?
No, absolutely. And I'll sort of give you two data points on that. And just last week, actually, and I forget if this was in the Wall Street Journal or some other online publication, where I read that it was most likely the Wall Street Journal, where they had a very nice article where actually physicians are now asking their patients to use Apple Watches and make sure that they get access to that data, because they believe it's so valuable in them understanding how patients are living their lives in addition to the medication that they are on, right? So I think it's not that doctors are not pushing back, they're actually requesting the patients to sort of use these devices and get them the data, because I think now they have the adequate tools and resources, both human resources as well as technology resources at their disposal, to make sense out of this data, to mine this data, and know that when an intervention is needed or not. So that's one. And now, coming back specifically to the area now I work in at Electa, right? We also have a digital patient monitoring tool, or a remote patient monitoring tool, which is baked into our EHR. And we patients actually report their symptoms when they're on treatment. And a lot of this data comes back. It's also accessible to the patient via their patient portal and so on. But what's most important now is what we see is that we can now trigger early interventions from the clinical side to say, okay, if the patient is on a particular radiation treatment or a medical oncology treatment, what is a serious side effect versus what's a expected routine side effect, when an intervention should be happening earlier versus what can wait until the next patient appointment or the next patient treatment in the workflow. I think all of these factors, with the sort of the ability to get this data in instantaneously, and then the application of AI on top of it to say you mine this data intelligently. This is a classic example of converting real world data into real world evidence, triggering early interventions, and making sure that the quality of life that the patient has during some of these treatments, which can be pretty toxic in terms of dose delivered to the patient, or in terms of the toxicity, in terms of chemotherapy and so on, can be managed much more tightly. So I really feel that this is already making such a positive impact for patients who are on these kind of treatments.
Yeah, and this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but for the patients that are receiving that radiation therapy, whatever it may be, that's a bad circumstance to be in, or not one that anybody would choose to be in, and then that's a difficult set of medicines to ingest, whether intravenously or otherwise. I would imagine anything that
Mm.
you can do for your providers to improve that quality of life, perhaps improve adherence to a degree too. If a patient isn't dreading their next appointment, that's got to be huge in terms of outcomes.
Absolutely. And when they see that the clinical team is engaged between treatment cycles, between two patient appointments, they feel that they're being, looked after, they're being monitored. They can report their symptoms, of course, but these symptoms are being managed. I think the adherence is much better. The compliance of the patients is much higher. And this is extremely important for patients who are dealing with chronic conditions, as well as, certain types of treatments when they have cancer. So super important.
And this that kind of scratches at the surface of of value-based care and generating a positive outcome. So we're taking another kind of step off our main conversation topic, though. But there's a large degree of individual responsibility that has to take place for any value-based care panel to be
Yeah,
effective. You can't, abuse your body or do the wrong thing and expect
right.
a positive health outcome. So just again to come back to that main track with LLMs able to both mine data and perhaps even take a load off of that clinician, off of that provider, or off of that mid level in terms of a piece of standard correspondence, perhaps from a patient portal, something like that. Are you seeing any great use cases there?
No, we do. In fact, we also see that it's useful for the clinical team monitoring the patients, but ultimately keep in mind, as we generate a lot more of this data, this classic example of what we call real world evidence, it is also super useful for the drug companies, for the manufacturers of radiation therapy, for the people doing research in these areas, as to what's actually happening. They have access to all this data now to say, how can we make how can we control symptoms better, how can we manage toxicity yet being medically effective in sort of treating the disease at hand. So I think these are implications that we have not foreseen, but we can easily see that this is something that will impact the development of these new technologies going forward.
And that's such a good thing. I didn't quite finish my thought on the value based care, individual responsibility, but still the care team needs
Yeah,
to be able to intervene and say, hey, I understand this is difficult, but we need you to do it. We have to have you do this.
yeah,
Here's what we're going to
yeah,
do based on your feedback.
right.
And to go, I guess, to go a step back from that treatment of the patient and being able to ingest all of the data that they're providing to that care team and then relay it on down the line to those that matter, when you talk about AI in clinical decision making, especially with oncology, that has been a recurring response on this show of where do you think AI in healthcare goes? And that's to physicians, that's to surgery center administrators, that's to a wide variety of talking heads in the space. And that's always the first answer: diagnostic utilization or diagnostic use of AI. That seems to be right in your wheelhouse. Give us the lowdown there.
No, I think a few factors there, Eric. Right, one, when you say use in diagnostics, right? I mean, for me, when I look at sort of the workflow, Diagnosis leads to treatment, leads to, in case of oncology, also survivorship, managing quality of life, and so on. It's end to end, but it starts with the diagnosis of the patient, and then deciding what needs to happen after that, right? And that, I think, in the past, right, for sure, it was completely based either on the physician's expertise and sort of their own experiences. More and more over the years, you saw a lot of, how do I say this? A lot of guidelines being imposed either by, in case of oncology, by bodies like the National Cancer Institute, where they have the NCCN guidelines, and that just stands for Standard Care Pathways, and so on. And then a lot more coming from payers, like I said before, and also a lot more coming from specific provincial governments, and so on, right? So there's so many layers of information that have to be processed by a physician to say, now that I have this diagnosis, what's best for this patient. Now there's another angle which is becoming super relevant today, which is the patient's own preferences. Now, what are the social determinants of health for this patient? Is this patient coming to your clinic from the neighboring city if you are based in a suburb? Or is this patient going to drive 150 miles for every patient appointment because where they stay in a rural area, you are the closest clinic for this patient? So, what are these patients' preferences? How much toxicity can this patient tolerate? What are their preferences, right? Some patients have a higher willingness and some patients have a lower willingness. What are the other aspects of caregiving that this patient then has to deal with based on the side effects, and even longer, not just symptoms but side effects that they may have to live with after the treatment is over. So all of these criteria, like everything I said, in terms of the payer guidelines, push payers, push compliance, push the doctor's expertise, and so on, and then the patient preferences, social determinants of health, what the patient has to then live with based on what is the expected outcome. There's no magic bullet to say, if a doctor chooses pathway A, that's the outcome, and so on, and if you choose pathway B, that's the other outcome, and which one is better. So I think this is where LLMs can be really useful in sort of taking all of these parameters into account and then recommending and helping the physician to say likelihood of occurrence of something, which can be something to be discussed with the patient, that this is what we are looking at, the scenario analysis with the patient. Now, I don't think we are there yet in terms of these kind of solutions, which are very nuanced and rich, but we are seeing steps in that direction. We are seeing steps in terms of solutions coming out which are dealing with specific aspects of this problem. And what I really foresee is that you will now start to see solutions that will take all of these things into account holistically, and helping the physicians take really personalized treatment outcomes decisions for the patient. And I think that's really what we mean by personalized medicine. I mean, personalized medicine is a very cliche term in our space, as you know, but LLMs taking into account, I mean, they can take into account billions of parameters to generate a model, but taking into account data from so many sources, I think we are really looking at a future where personalized medicine is becoming more and more relevant, yet managing all these other not competing, but other factors that a physician has to deal with.
Our conversation is branching because I'm having two thoughts here. Number one is around LLMs. I want to pause for just a second for our listeners who are maybe just a casual tech enthusiast. They hear LLM. We're not talking about ChatGPT. We're talking about a tailor-made large language model for a specific purpose. So there are more than one type of LLM out there. Some are custom, some are commercially available. So just want to be totally clear there. Hopefully, I'm doing that justice.
Absolutely.
And then secondarily, personalized medicine, we've talked about value-based care. There's a ton of different definitions. AI, there's a lot of different definitions. But personalized medicine is really interesting when you talk about the sequencing of a genome. That's a ton of information. You just mentioned billions of parameters to create, to ingest and then spit out as part of a model. Are you seeing anything around human genome sequencing for an individual into an LLM to provide the very best possible outcome, or maybe the most effective drugs in a given scenario?
No, absolutely. And I'll try to combine my answer to address both these issues that you mentioned, right? Now, when you talk of LLMs, these are definitely custom LLMs. This is not just taking off the shelf LLMs that are, they're more general purpose. They're mining information that's available on the internet. What we are looking at is models that are developed specifically taking into account healthcare information. And this healthcare information, for as input to the large language model, can be all the parameters that are taken into account by taking the input from a human genome sequence. It can be taken as input from medical images. They can be just EHR data. They can be lab results. So there are so many parameters that you can train a specific model in for a targeted outcome. And then you say, okay, what therapies you want to look at, and sort of what are the outcomes, what has happened over the past years. And like everything else in healthcare, it's not always technology that is the challenge. The challenge is getting the relevant data to train your models on. That will continue to remain a challenge because it's not easy to sort of structure this data in. And that's where the beauty of the LLMs come in, because they can take in unstructured data to generate sort of patterns that, is otherwise very difficult to do in a non-LLM world, right? So that's sort of to answer your first question, or for your first point. And responding to your second point, right? I have an example, maybe not so much from the human genome sequence, but if I look at imaging, for example, we can already see there are companies that are coming up who are they're taking input from medical images and then determining that, there are very costly oncology treatments. And they are saying they study the data, of course, mainly imaging, but also other data, and possibly human genome. The sequencing of the genome can be a factor in there also as an input parameter to say how likely is the patient going to be successful if they undergo this multi-million immunotherapy or certain other therapy, right? And this is of interest to the payers because they want to know for sure before you sort of go down that route, because even the patients have to pay, even if these are covered treatments, very expensive treatments. So everybody has to pay. What's the likelihood of success? Number two, for the clinical team to say, okay, should we go down this route, because it's an opportunity cost. You cannot simultaneously put patients on 5 different treatments. You have to say what's the best for this patient. And third, for the patient to say, okay, apart from the financial aspect, the clinical relevancy of the outcomes of after going through certain treatments. So we're already seeing vendors getting to use LLMs, taking into account these kind of input from imaging parameters from human genome sequences to say how likely is the success of a certain treatment going to be. Should you even go down that path, or should you explore other paths? Because otherwise, you are left at the as a patient, you are left at sort of just having a discussion with the clinician and then figuring out what's best, right? It's not that data driven. And I think what LLMs help here is how LLMs help here is to bring that data into the discussion, and sort of forecasting sort of the likelihood of success. And I think that's very, very important.
With what you just said, in a patient speaking to their physician scenario only, where they don't have the full brunt of all this data to bear, all you can do at that point is get a second opinion, and maybe that
Yes,
provider
yeah,
agrees, doesn't
yeah.
agree, isn't using data, is using data. This kind of ties into another part of your example here, that if you're like meaningfully aligning the patient, the provider, and the payer, that seems like a big step towards fixing at least some amount of what's so broken with US healthcare.
Absolutely. It also is going to help us reduce the friction in the US healthcare system between precisely the parties that you mentioned here, right? By having by bringing relevancy in addition to experience and expertise. And that's how I always say it. The holy grail towards personalized medicine is to bring relevancy in addition to the experience and expertise of the clinical team. And that relevancy comes in terms of bringing data into the discussion, and the data being used to sort of the models and the data helping you predict what outcomes are going to be more successful for this patient. And that is what will lead to best personalized medicine. This will take time. I think everything in healthcare, it's not that it's going to happen next year immediately. This will take time. The level of adoption will vary based on the criticality of sort of, is it sort of something you take up in a chronic care case or an episodic care case, and so on. So you will see the level of adoption happening at different speeds in different therapeutic areas for sure.
And I want to go back to something you said to lead off the show. The thing that's the most important to you, and I'm paraphrasing, is to make a positive impact on as many patients as possible. And this is a genuine point of curiosity that you have the perfect patient that has a lot of data. They're affluent. They have access to physicians. They see specialists, and they have a fairly complete personal health record, longitudinal for their time. You have another patient, on the other hand, who maybe doesn't have access to all the same care, but is in a situation where they really need help, whatever that scenario may be. What, to use your phrase, either something episodic or something more long term. With the advent of all of these LLMs and all of this data and all of this processing power that maybe isn't personalized strictly to that patient, but are we able to provide a better outcome to that maybe historically underserved patient or that population based on everybody else's data?
No, absolutely. I think that is the goal we are after, right? If the patient is in a place where they do bring all the data to the table because they have the means to undergo all the diagnostic tests, collect all the data, and then we can use the data to, of course, get the best treatment for that patient. But in another scenario, like you aptly described, a lot of that data may be missing for that patient because of either the lack of not having the right diagnostics available. Not everywhere in the world you can get your genome sequenced, right?
Right.
I mean, that's just not possible. Not everywhere in the world you will have the highest quality imaging equipment available to get the best imaging, but you may have a fairly standard set of imaging available. You may have other lab results being available. So, where can technology help you is to say, can we make certain, I would not like to use the word assumptions, but can we make certain models where they can learn from whatever data they have as to how that can sort of map into other information that's available elsewhere? For training purposes, deploy that model in another scenario and still recommend the best treatment possible. Now, again, like I said before, this is the scenario we want to go after. This will take time, but this is really what and how we can help deliver the best treatment globally to patients everywhere, even when there are limited means to collect all the data needed for that one patient case.
And I think I'm looking for your clarification here, Anish, that even in
Yeah,
that first patient example where they've got a lot of data for themselves and the population in which they're surrounded also has a lot of data, and you can fairly, with as much certainty as is possible, provide a strong prediction versus that second patient where we don't really have your data, but we have your population's data, and we can make
correct,
implications or make assumptions about it,
correct,
like you said.
right,
No matter what.
right. And I no, sorry, just to add one point there. The good thing here is that there are many governments across the world. Like if you look at the UK, I mean the NHS is certainly under stress at this time, but they're running a huge initiative called the UK Biobank, where they're trying to collect information across the country and then allowing, of course, they anonymize all this information, and then they're allowing researchers access to this information. And then you have like the initiative of the SEER data for oncology outcomes in the US, where this data is publicly available for researchers to use. So access to this kind of data, deploying models then to learn from this data, and then using that during a particular patient's case. This is what I mean. You can bring relevancy into context, of course, for the patient when you have the data for that patient available. But even if you don't have all of the data available for that patient, using all these generic, widely, wide or broad data sets available will be certainly of help.
Way better than nothing. And
Way better than, of course, absolutely.
the clarification I want your expertise on here is that whether you have the complete personal data set in addition to a really strong cohort or population data set, or whether you don't, we're not talking about definite outcomes. We're talking about a probability of an outcome across a range of outcomes, right?
Correct. Absolutely. We're not talking about definite outcome. I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult to have definite outcomes, I think, for a long time. And there's no magic here. The science itself is so dependent on how the body reacts to treatment. So, but it's sort of the range of scenarios and what will be better for, like I said, for that patient, given what conditions they have to face after the treatment is over as well. So all of these things have to be factored in.
So here's the question. I'm not trying to trip you up with it, but I work in health IT. I'm fairly well versed in tech. God forbid there's some big health issue that I have. I not only want the best provider, just like we all would, we want the best doctor, but I also want that
Absolutely.
doctor to be using tools that have, if not a billion, a trillion data points, which it's seen and it's fairly consistent in the probabilities of outcomes that it provides. And I want this doctor to be in a group where all the other doctors are using these same tools. I want all of the information possible along with the human expertise. So I don't personally see a downside here. Is there one?
So just to understand your question, of course, I think as a patient, your desire is that you go to a physician group where all of the information is accessible. Maybe you can clarify that a little bit for me, Eric. What is the
Sure. I was painting
yeah
a big picture there, a big
yeah
picture. So
yeah
if
yeah
I'm a patient, I want to go to the best
mm-hmm.
doctor, and I want that doctor to be
Yeah,
using the best software that has the biggest data set possible, biggest accurate data set possible, so that not only do I
yeah,
have
yeah,
the guidance of an expert physician, but he's also
right,
using the right tools or she's using the right tools. So I don't see
right.
any downside to bringing AI into healthcare, bringing LLMs responsibly. We're talking. There's a limit here, but the part that isn't meant to be the gotcha question, but kind of is, what's the downside? Why wouldn't somebody want to use these tools?
Oh yeah, it's a very interesting question. Let me put it that way. Uh, in an ideal world, absolutely, I think the best models should be something that every physician clinical team has access to, and then they can decide what's best. Now, also, we live in a world where this information is procured. It's not easy to procure this information to train your models on, and sort of vendors who will have access to this information, they will deploy their own solutions. Now, I think the question to rather to ask is, what are the incentives that we have in our system to make sure that this information is shared? Now, if I take the regulatory aspect of this, right, or the compliance aspect of this, the in the US specifically, there have been very good initiatives in the last few years, such as the 21st Century Cures Act. If the viewers are familiar with it, it sort of mandates that vendors and healthcare systems share this information when patients want it, or somebody who's acting on behalf of the patient is requesting this information, right? So I think these are steps in the right direction. Now, keep in mind, with every compliance requirement, there's of course the cost of compliance also goes up. So there are these trade-offs that have to be managed in the system, and there are people who are, this is beyond my expertise of course, but who have to manage sort of what's the right balance between imposing the interoperability needs versus the cost of making these of meeting these interop needs by the providers and the hospitals and so on. But I think these are steps that will really help to answer your question, as to say, the more this information is out there, the more we will have standardization in terms of making sure that everybody gets as equal care as possible, regardless of where they go to. Are they going to the best academic center in their area? Or they're going to a community hospital somewhere else, and so on, right? So evening the level play, or leveling the playing field as much as possible by making sure that the data is publicly available, that these solutions. And that's where, even the cloud comes in the beginning I made a comment that we try to deploy all of this innovation, no matter how we deploy our technology in the cloud and so on. But if these technologies are being deployed in the cloud, then everybody has access to these technologies, no matter where you're based. So adoption of cloud, pushing the right level of regulation in terms of interoperability, even if the interop is not of all the data itself, but of sort of what needs to be shared between healthcare systems to deliver the right quality, the right treatment for the patients. These kind of steps will help, and this will take time. But I think when it comes to sort of the vendors who are developing these technologies, they definitely have the incentive that they want to deliver these innovation in their solution, right? So that's sort of the balance we will have to look at, for sure. Yeah.
That's interesting. I thought for maybe a second you might go down the path of maintaining the confidentiality of PHI and other PII. So it sounds like it's more of a roadblock to data right now, which we've had in the U.S. for the last 15 years. With
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
these disparate EHRs.
Absolutely. But I think we have crossed the hurdle of the PHI and PII because all of the models can be developed on anonymized data itself, right? And that has been happening for a while. Getting the consent from the patient, of course, is absolutely critical. And then safeguarding that information is absolutely critical, making sure that that information does not go into the wrong hands and so on. And I think a lot of safeguards by the vendors, by the security players in the industry, as well as safeguards from the authorities, I think those are already in place. The challenge is making sure the innovation that comes out of it, how do you make sure that innovation is shared? How do we how does one kind of innovation interoperate with the other kind of innovation, for example, right? Those I think are the hurdles to be looked at going forward, more so in my mind.
Yeah, and to be clear on the vendor side, it's table stakes now. Of course, you need to
Absolutely.
have
Yeah.
security. My mind
Absolutely.
went more towards the patient side. You know, that consent. I don't want my information in the cloud. And
Correct. Correct.
in
Yeah.
2024, most people in the
Yeah.
U.S. at least have a smartphone. You don't have privacy
Yes.
anymore. It's already we've passed that. We've crossed the Rubicon.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Well, then looking ahead, we've covered a lot of sort of the future of how AI and how LLMs can help provide better outcomes for patients. Is there to your knowledge, is there a disease that's in the crosshairs now that if we have better management of huge data sets, we can eradicate this particular disease? Does anything come to mind?
Well, I mean, working in oncology, I mean, if you ask me of the moonshot, I mean, the cancer moonshot for me is really the one that always comes to mind and is always top of my mind, right? Eradicating cancer, I don't know if that's possible, but certainly managing, controlling it, and early detection, early treatment, and relevant treatment. I think with the explosion of data, putting LLMs on it, I think we can really, really handle this challenge. And unfortunately, it is a challenge which is only growing as people live longer, as our lifestyle change, as we have an explosion of so many other factors in our environment. The uptick of cancer cases is real, and I think for me, the holy grail is using technologies like large language models, harnessing the data, not only in sort of the treatment of the disease, but hopefully, and this is sort of beyond my expertise now, but hopefully also understanding why our environmental factors are causing an increase in certain diseases, right? And managing those factors too, right? I mean, this is not just healthcare, then it's also sort of managing our environment, managing the carcinogens that are seeping into our environment and so on. So I am also very optimistic that we can gain insight into those factors as well using large language models.
You took the words right out of my mouth because managing the environmental factors, managing the personal choices that are made. I mean, yeah, I hate to frame it this way, but if you're still smoking cigarettes in 2024, you've got a pretty good idea of the risks. But
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. Yeah.
as LLMs become more and more powerful, and I imagine we're at the beginning of that uptick in the J curve, the hockey stick, where we're going to have essentially limitless, and that's easy for me to say, being that I'm not on the tech or the development side, but essentially limitless computing power. I would imagine
Yeah.
the prevention of some of these cancers will become
Yeah.
more straightforward. I don't want to say easier, but if you're able to look at a medical record and then along with environmental factors and the personal choices, if they're being logged correctly, I'd imagine prevention will be more possible.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to have a conversation from a physician to a patient to say, hey, if you're smoking when you're 25 and you continue doing that until you're 40, 50, you are going to, unfortunately, you're a high risk of having lung cancer, right? But another discussion to say, if you are of this genotype, phenotype, and you're still smoking 2 packs a day from 25 to age 40, the likelihood that you will have lung cancer is 95%. That's a whole different conversation of saying, you better stop now. You're being stupid, right? So I think we are sort of making that prevention case to be made so much stronger, and I feel that should have an impact. And it's easy to pick on smoking because the correlation has been proven, but there are so many other things that we don't even know about, and I think that's the hope that we can also look at those.
Absolutely. Yeah, smoking's the low man on the totem pole in terms of
Correct.
correlation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, Anish, as we kind of get to the tail end of our discussion, what else would you want listeners to know? Whether you were screaming from a mountaintop to every physician organization in the US or the world, or to patients across the world, what would you want them to know?
I think maybe two things, and to sort of recap what you said at the beginning, Eric, here is to say, AI is not going to replace providers. There's no way that will happen. At the same time, let's not push back on it. I think we need to sort of keep an open mind, look at opportunities where the AI technologies will actually help us make patient lives better. So let's embrace those. Of course, keeping in mind that with every such adoption of a new technology, there's risk, and we have to manage the risk and we have to manage it intelligently. So that's the one thing I will continue to scream from the mountaintop.
Well put. And I shared this before we started to record. All of my non-AI, non-technical guests, they're clinical, but maybe not technical. I asked them what are their thoughts about AI in healthcare. We've just gotten your thoughts about AI in healthcare. So the one I really want to ask you: how far away from a generalized artificial intelligence do you think we are, if it's even possible?
Okay, maybe you have to clarify the question a little bit better, Eric, for me to understand. Sorry.
Sure, sure. So I was just leading in that listeners of the show will
Yeah,
know I generally conclude with what do you think will be the future of AI in healthcare? And we've gotten your thoughts. We've gotten the
yeah.
state of AI in healthcare and where we're going. So for you, I think the more interesting question will be around general artificial intelligence. So I don't want to put the thoughts of Terminator and Skynet in anybody's head, but is that
Yeah,
possible? And if it is, what's it going to take to get to a real general AI?
I think it's going to happen. I have no doubt about it. It's sort of, I think the the Terminator or the Matrix kind of analogies, of course, are scary, right? We don't have to be scared by those kind of things. But if you even look at, I mean, what I'm very optimistic about is that these technologies are going to help us in terms of the profile of the population pyramid that we're looking at. People are living longer, people are having fewer children, and I'm getting into sort of an aspect. As a nation, we have to deal with these aspects. We are going to have a more aging population going into the next century, even into the end of this century. And technologies like AI are going to help us adapt to these changes much better. We have fewer younger people working, more aged population. The needs that we see in our society today are going to be radically different 50 years from today than what we see today, right? So when you look at the general AI, right, you already see the sort of the Alexas and so on helping with home automation, but imagine so much more automation coming into play with AI to deal with sort of the society that we would be staring at down the line. And I think that's where generally AI will be of tremendous help to us.
Well said. Really well put. So on our way out here, Anish, where can listeners connect with you? Are you big on LinkedIn or?
LinkedIn.
Okay,
LinkedIn is best to connect with me. Please reach out. Happy to connect with folks for anything.
I'll be sure to get a link to your profile in the show notes. Anything else you want to add?
No, that's good, Eric. It was great talking to you.
It was a pleasure to have you on, Anish. And on behalf of the entire Doc Buddy team, we want to thank you for listening. Be sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube so you always get the newest episodes of the show. And until next time, I'm your host, Eric. Talk soon.